Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be reading Up from Slavery, starting at page 177, Raising Money.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
Up from Slavery, Chapter 12, Raising Money. When we opened our boarding department, we provided rooms in the attic of Porter Hall, our first building, for a number of girls. But the number of students of both sexes continued to increase. We could find rooms outside the school grounds for many of the young men, but the girls we did not care to expose in this way. Very soon, the problem of providing more rooms for the girls, as well as a larger boarding department for all the students, grew serious. As a result, we finally decided to undertake the construction of still a larger building, a building that would contain rooms for the girls and boarding accommodations for all. Greetings, Black Magus. I'm so glad you're here. After having had a preliminary sketch of the needed building made, we found that it would cost about $10,000. We had no money whatever to begin with. Still, we decided to give the needed building a name. We knew we could name it, even though we were in doubt about our ability to secure the means for its construction. We decided to call the proposed building Alabama Hall in honor of the state in which we were laboring. Again, Miss Davidson began making efforts to enlist the interest and help of the colored and white people in and near Tuskegee. They responded willingly, in proportion to their means. The students, as in the case of our first building, Porter Hall, began digging out the dirt in order to allow the laying of the foundations. When we seemed at the end of our resources, so far as securing money was concerned, something occurred which showed the greatness of General Armstrong, something which proved how far he was above the ordinary individual. When we were in the midst of the great anxiety as to where and how we would get the funds for the new building, I received a telegram from General Armstrong asking me if I could spend a month traveling with him through the North and asking me if I could do so to come to Hampton at once. Of course, I accepted General Armstrong's invitation and went to Hampton immediately. Upon arriving there, I found that the general had decided to take a quartet of singers through the North and hold meetings for a month in important cities, at which meetings he and I were to speak. Imagine my surprise when the general told me further that these meetings were to be held in the interest of not of Hampton, but in the interest of Tuskegee, and that the Hampton Institute was to be responsible for all the expenses. Greetings, KW Don 7. Thanks for tuning in. Although he never told me that in so many words, I found that General Armstrong took this method of introducing me to the people of the North, as well as for the sake of securing some immediate funds to be used in the erection of Alabama Hall. A weak and narrow man would have reasoned that all the money which came to Tuskegee in this way would be just so much taken from the Hampton Institute. But none of these selfish or short-sighted feelings ever entered the breast of General Armstrong. He was too big to be little and too good to be mean. He knew that the people in the North who gave money gave it for the purpose of helping the whole of Negro civilization, and not merely for the advancement of any one school. The general knew, too, that the way to strengthen Hampton was to make it a center of unselfish power in the working out of the whole Southern problem. In regard to the addresses which I was to make in the North, I recall just one piece of advice which the general gave me. He said, "Give him an idea for every word." I think it would be hard to improve upon this advice, and it might be made to apply to all public speaking. From that time to the present, I have always tried to keep his advice in mind. Meetings were held in New York, Brooklyn, Boston, Philadelphia, and other large cities. And at the center of all these meetings, General Armstrong pleaded, together with myself, for help, not for Hampton, but for Tuskegee. At these meetings, an especial effort was made to help secure the building of Alabama Hall, as well as to introduce the school to the attention of the general public. In both these respects, the meetings proved successful. After that kindly introduction, I began going north alone to secure funds. During the last 15 years, I have been compelled to spend a large proportion of my time away from the school in an effort to secure money to provide for the growing needs of the institution. In my efforts to get funds, I have had some experiences that may be of interest to my readers. Time and time again, I have been asked by people who are trying to secure money for philanthropic purposes what rule or rules I followed to secure the interest and help of people who were able to contribute money to worthy objects. As far as the science of what is called begging can be reduced to rules, I would say that I have had but two rules. First, always to do my whole duty regarding making our work known to individuals and organizations. And second, not to worry about the results. This second rule has been the hardest for me to live up to. When the bills are on the eve of falling due with not a dollar in hand with which to meet them, it is pretty difficult to learn to not worry. Although I think I am learning more and more each year that all worry simply consumes and to no purpose, just so much physical and mental strength that might otherwise be given to effective work. After considerable experience in coming into contact with wealthy and noted men, I have observed that those who have accomplished the greatest results are those who keep under the body, are those who never grow excited or lose self-control, but are always calm, self-possessed, patient, and polite. I think that President William McKinley is the best example of a man of this class that I have ever seen. Greetings, Forecast. Thanks for tuning in. In order to be successful in any kind of undertaking, I think the main thing for one is to grow to the point where he completely forgets himself. That is, to lose himself in a great cause. In proportion as one loses himself in this way, in the same degree does he get the highest happiness out of his work. My experience in getting money for Tuskegee has taught me to have no patience with those people who are always condemning the rich because they are rich and because they do not give more to objects of charity. In the first place, those who are guilty of such sweeping criticisms do not know how many people would be made poor and how much suffering would result if wealthy people were to part all at once with any large proportion of their wealth in a way to disorganize and cripple great business enterprises. So he was not a socialist. Then, very few persons have any idea of the large number of applications for help that rich people are constantly being flooded with. I know wealthy people who receive as many as 20 calls a day for help. More than once, when I have gone into the offices of rich men, I have found myself among half a dozen other persons waiting to see them, and all come for the same purpose, that of securing money. And all these calls in person, to say nothing of the applications received through the mails. Very few people have any idea of the amount of money given away by persons who never permit their names to be known. I have often heard persons condemned for not giving away money, who, to my own knowledge, were giving away thousands of dollars every year so quietly that the world knew nothing about it. Move in silence. As an example of this, there are two ladies in New York whose names rarely appear in print, but who, in a quiet way, have given us the means with which to erect three large and important buildings during the last 8 years. Besides the gifts of these buildings, they have made other generous donations to the school, and they not only help Tuskegee, but they are constantly seeking opportunities to help other worthy causes. Although it has been my privilege to be the medium through which a good many hundred thousands of dollars have been received for the work at Tuskegee, I have always avoided what the world calls begging. I often tell people that I have never begged for any money, and that I am not a beggar. My experience and observation have convinced me that persistent asking outright for the money from the rich does not, as a rule, secure help. I have usually proceeded on the principle that persons who possess sense enough to earn money have sense enough to know how to give it away, and that the mere making known of the facts regarding Tuskegee, and especially the facts regarding the work of the graduates, has been more effective than outright begging. I think the presentation of facts on a high, dignified plane is all the begging that most rich people care for. So don't beg. While the work of going from door to door and from office to office is hard, disagreeable, and costly in bodily strength, yet it has some compensations. Such work gives one a rare opportunity to study human nature. It also has its compensations in giving one an opportunity to meet some of the best people in the world. To be more correct, I think I should say the best people in the world. When one takes a broad survey of the country, he will find that the most useful and influential people in it are those who take the deepest interest in institutions that exist for the purpose of making the world better. At one time, when I was in Boston, I called at the door of a rather wealthy lady and was admitted to the vestibule and sent my card up. While I was waiting for an answer, her husband came in. He asked me in the most abrupt manner what I wanted. I tried to explain the object of my call, but he became still more ungentlemanly in his words and manner, and finally grew so excited that I left his house without waiting for a reply from the lady. A few blocks from that house, I called to see a gentleman who received me in the most cordial manner. He wrote me a check for a generous sum, and then, before I had an opportunity to thank him, said, I am grateful to you, Mr. Washington, for giving me the opportunity to help a good cause. It is a privilege to have a share in it. We in Boston are constantly indebted to you for doing our work. My experience in securing money convinces me that the first type of man is growing more rare all the time, and that the latter type is increasing. That is, that more and more rich people are coming to regard men and women who apply to them for help for worthy objects not as beggars, but as agents for doing their work. Greetings, Anthony McPhail. How are you this evening? In the city of Boston, I have rarely called upon an individual for funds that I have not thanked for calling, usually before I could get an opportunity to thank the donor for the money. In that city, the donors seem to feel, in a large degree, that an honor is being conferred upon them in their being permitted to give. Nowhere else have I met with, in so large a measure, this fine and Christ-like this fine and Christ-like spirit as in the city of Boston. Although there are many notable instances of it outside of that city, I repeat, my belief is that the world is growing in this direction of giving. I repeat that the main rule by which I have been guided in collecting money is to do my full duty in regard to giving people who have money an opportunity to help. So you have to go to people that have money and give them the opportunity to help whatever your cause is. Message. In the early years of the Tuskegee School, I walked the streets or traveled country roads in the North for days and days without receiving a dollar. Now, often as it happened, when during the week I had been disappointed in not getting a cent from the very individuals from whom I expected the most help, and when I was almost broken down and discouraged, that generous help has come from someone who I had little idea would give at all. I recall that on one occasion I obtained information that led me to believe that a gentleman who lived about 2 miles out in the country from Stamford, Connecticut, might become interested in our efforts at Tuskegee if our conditions and needs were presented to him. On an unusually cold and stormy day, I walked 2 miles to see him. After some difficulty, I succeeded in securing an interview with him. He listened with some degree of interest to what I had to say, but did not give me anything. I could not help having the feeling that, in a measure, the 3 hours that I had spent in seeing him had been thrown away. Still, I have followed my usual rule of doing my duty. If I had not been, if I had not seen him, I should have felt unhappy over neglect of duty. 2 years after this visit, a letter came to Tuskegee from this man which read like this: Enclosed, I send you a New York draft of $10,000 to be used in the furtherance of your work. I have placed this sum in my will for your school, but deem it wiser to give it to you while I live. I recall with pleasure your visit to me 2 years ago. I can hardly imagine any occurrence which could have given me more genuine satisfaction than the receipt of this draft. It was by far the largest single donation which up to that time the school had ever received. It came at a time when an unusually long period had passed since we had received any money. We were in great distress because of our lack of funds, and the nervous strain was tremendous. It is difficult for me to think of any situation that is more trying on the nerves than that of conducting a large institution with heavy financial obligations to meet without knowing where the money is to come from to meet these obligations from month to month. In our case, I felt a double responsibility, and this made the anxiety all the more intense. If the institution had been officered by white persons and had failed, it would have injured the cause of Negro education. But I knew that the failure of our institution, officered by Negroes, would not only mean the loss of a school, but would cause people in a large degree to lose faith in the ability of the entire race. The receipt of this draft for $10,000 under these circumstances partially lifted a burden that had been pressing down upon me for days. From the beginning of our work to the present, I have always had the feeling and lose no opportunity to impress our teachers with the same idea that the school will always be supported in proportion as the inside of the institution is kept clean and pure and wholesome. The first time I ever saw the late Collis P. Huntington, the great railroad man, he gave me $2 for our school. The last time I saw him, which was a few months before he died, he gave me $50,000 toward our endowment fund. Between these two gifts, there were others of generous proportions which came every year from both Mr. and Mrs. Huntington. Some people may say that it was Tuskegee's good luck that has brought us this gift of $50,000. No, it was not luck. It was hard work. Nothing ever comes to one that is worth having except as a result of hard work. When Mr. Huntington gave me his first $2, I did not blame him for not giving me more, but made up my mind that I was going to convince him by tangible results that we were worthy of larger gifts. For a dozen years, I made a strong effort to convince Mr. Huntington of the value of our work. I noted that just in proportion as the usefulness of our school grew, his donations increased. Never did I meet an individual who took more kindly and sympathetic interest in our school than did Mr. Huntington. He not only gave money to us, but took time in which to advise me, as a father would a son, about the general conduct of the school. So he has something to say about how they ran the school as well. More than once, I have found myself in some pretty tight places while collecting money in the North. The following incident I have never related but once before, for the reason that I feared that people would not believe it. One morning, I found myself in Providence, Rhode Island, without a cent of money with which to buy breakfast. In crossing the street to see a lady from whom I had hoped to get some money, I found a bright new 25-cent piece in the middle of the streetcar track. I not only had this 25 cents for my breakfast, but within a few minutes I had a donation from the lady on whom I started to call. At one of our commencements, I was bold enough to invite Reverend E. Winchester Donald, D.D., rector of the Trinity Church, Boston, to preach the commencement sermon. As we had as we then had no room large enough to accommodate all who would be present, the place of the meeting was under a large improvised arbor built partly out of brush and partly out of rough boards. Soon after Dr. Donald had begun speaking, the rain came down in torrents and he had to stop while someone held an umbrella over him. The boldness of what I have done never dawned upon me until I saw the picture made by the rector of Trinity Church standing before the large audience under an old umbrella, waiting for the rain to cease so that he could go on with his address. It was not very long before the rain ceased and Dr. Donald finished his sermon. And an excellent sermon it was, too, in spite of the weather. After he had gone to his room and had gotten the wet threads of his clothes dry, Dr. Donald ventured the remark that a large chapel at Tuskegee would not be out of place. The next day, a letter came from two ladies who were traveling in Italy saying that they had decided to give us the money for such a chapel as we needed. A short time ago, we received $20,000 from Mr. Andrew Carnegie to be used for the purpose of erecting a new library building. Our first library and reading room were in a corner of a shanty, and the whole thing occupied a space of about 5 by 12 feet. It required 10 years of work before I was able to secure Mr. Carnegie's help and interest. The first time I saw him 10 years ago, he seemed to take little interest in our school, but I was determined to show him that we were worthy of his help. After 10 years of hard work, I wrote him a letter that reads as follows: December 15th, 1900. Mr. Carnegie, 5 West 51st Street, New York, New York. And the letter reads, Dear Sir, complying with the request you made of me when I saw you at your residence a few days ago, I submit in writing an appeal for a library building for our institution. We have 1,100 students, 86 officers and instructors, together with their families, and about 200 colored people living near the school, all of whom would make use of this library building. We have over 12,000 books and periodicals, etc., gifts from our friends, but we have no suitable place for them and have no suitable reading room. Our graduates go to work in every section of the South, and whatever knowledge might be obtained in the library would serve to assist in the elevation of the whole Negro race. Such a building as we need could be erected for about $20,000. All of the work for the building, such as the brick making, brick masonry, carpentry, blacksmithing, etc., would be done by the students. The money which you would give would not only supply the building, but the erection of the building would give a large number of students the opportunity to learn the building trades, and students would use the money paid to them to keep themselves in school. I do not believe that a similar amount of money could be made to go so far in uplifting a whole race. If you wish further information, I shall be glad to furnish it. Yours truly, Booker T. Washington, Principal. Carnegie wanted a written budget about what Booker T. Washington was going to do. And this is why it's important to have a business plan that's been thought out with a budget and estimates and projections when you're asking people for money. When you apply for grants, that's one of the first things they ask you for is your business plan. When you go to the bank to apply for loans, they ask you for your business plan and they need detailed information about your business, your product line, your forecasts and projections, how much money you think you need, what you're going to do with the money, and why you're going to do that with the money. The next mail brought back the following reply. I will be very glad to help pay the bills for the library building as they are incurred to the extent of $20,000. And I am glad for this opportunity to show the interest I have in your noble work. I have found that strict business methods go a long way in the securing the interests of rich people. It has been my constant aim at Tuskegee to carry out our financial and other operations, such business methods as would be approved of by any New York banking house. I have spoken of several large gifts to the school, but by far the greater proportion of the money that has built up the institution has come in the form of small donations from persons of moderate means. It is upon these small gifts, which carry with them the interest of hundreds of donors, that any philanthropic work must depend largely on for its support. In my effort to get money, I have often been surprised at the patience and deep interest of the ministers who are besieged on every hand and at all hours of the day for help. If no other consideration had convinced me of the value of the Christian life, the Christ-like work which the Church of all denominations of America has done during the last 35 years for the elevation of the Black man would have made me a Christian. In a large degree, it has been the pennies, nickels, and dimes which have come from the Sunday schools, the Christian Endeavor societies, and the missionary societies, as well as from the church proper, that have helped to elevate the Negro at so rapid a rate. This, speaking of small gifts, reminds me to say that very few Tuskegee graduates fail to send us an annual contribution. These contributions range from 25 cents up to $10. Soon after beginning our third year's work, we were surprised to receive money from three special sources, and up to the present time, we have continued to receive help from them. First, the state legislature of Alabama increased its annual appropriation from $2,000 to $3,000. I might add that still later it increased this sum to $4,500 a year. The effort to secure this increase was led by the Honorable M.F. Foster, the member of the legislature from Tuskegee. Second, we received $1,000 from the John F. Slater Fund. Our work seemed to please the trustees of this fund as they soon began increasing their annual grant. This has been added to from time to time until at present we receive $11,000 annually from this fund. The other help, which I have referred to, came in the shape of an allowance from the Peabody Fund. This was at first $500, but it has since been increased to $1,500. The effort to secure help from the Slater and Peabody funds brought me into contact with two rare men who have had much to do in shaping the policy for the education of the Negro. I refer to the Honorable J.L.M. Curry of Washington, who is the general agent for these two funds, and Mr. Morris K. Jessup of New York. Dr. Curry is a native of the South and an ex-Confederate soldier, yet I do not believe there is any man in the country who is more deeply interested in the highest welfare of the Negro than Dr. Curry, or one who is more free from race prejudice. He was a former Confederate, which means he owned slaves. So he wanted to control the direction of education that the Negro's education took. Remember that. He enjoys the distinction of possessing an equal degree the confidence of the black man and the southern white man. I shall never forget the first time I met him. It was in Richmond, Virginia, where he was living. I had heard much about him. When I first went into his presence, trembling because of my youth and inexperience, he took me by the hand so cordially and spoke so much encouraging words and gave me such helpful advice regarding the proper course to pursue that I came to know him then as I have known him ever since, as a high example of one who is constantly and unselfishly at work for the betterment of humanity. Mr. Morris K. Jessup, the treasurer of the Slater Fund, I refer to because I know of no man of wealth and large and complicated business responsibilities who gives not only money but his time and thought to the subject of the proper method of elevating the Negro to the extent that is true of Mr. Jessup. It is very largely through his effort and influence that during the last few years the subject of industrial education has assumed the importance that it has and has been placed on its present footing. So Mr. Jessup was responsible for the industrial education, so Booker T. Washington says. And that's the end of chapter 12. Chapter 13 says, 2,000 miles for a 5-minute speech. Soon after the opening of the boarding department, quite a number of students who evidently were worthy, but who were so poor that they did not have any money to even pay the small charges at the school, began applying for admission. This class was composed of both men and women. It was a great trial to refuse admission to these applicants, and in 1884 we established a night school to accommodate a few of them. The night school was organized on a plan similar to the one in which I had helped to establish at Hampton. At first, it was composed of about a dozen students. They were admitted to the night school only when they had no money with which to pay any part of their board in the regular day school. It was further required that they must work for 10 hours during the day at some trade or industry and study academic branches for 2 hours during the evening. This was the requirement for the first 1 or 2 years of their stay. They were to be paid something above the cost of their board, with the understanding that all of their earnings, except a very small part, were to be reserved in the school's treasury to be used for paying their board in the regular day school after they had entered that department. The night school started in this manner has grown until there are at present 457 students enrolled in it alone. There could hardly be a more severe test of a student's worth than this branch of the Institute's work. It is largely because it furnishes such a good opportunity to test the backbone of a student that I place such a high value upon our night school. Anyone who is willing to work 10 hours a day at the brickyard or in the laundry through 1 or 2 years in order that he or she may have the privilege of studying academic branches for 2 hours in the evening has enough bottom to warrant being further educated. After the student has left the night school, he enters the day school, where he takes academic branches 4 days a week and works at his trade 2 days. Besides this, he usually works at his trade during the 3 summer months. As a rule, after a student has succeeded in going through the night school test, he finds a way to finish the regular course in industry and academic training. No student, no matter how much money he may be able to command, is permitted to go through school without doing manual labor. In fact, the industrial work is now as popular as the academic branches. Some of the most successful men and women who have graduated from the institution obtained their start in the night school. A great deal of stress is laid upon the industrial side of work at Tuskegee. We do not neglect nor overlook in any degree the religious and spiritual side. The school is strictly undenominational, but it is thoroughly Christian, and the spiritual training of the students is not neglected. Our preaching service, prayer meetings, Sunday school, Christian Endeavor Society, Young Men Christians Association, and various missionary organizations testify to this. In 1885, Miss Olivia Davidson, to whom have already referred as being largely responsible for the success of the school during its early history, and I were married. During our married life, she continued to divide her time and strength between our home and the work of the school. She not only continued to work in the school at Tuskegee, but she kept up her habit of going north to secure funds. In 1889, she died after 4 years of happily married life and 8 years of hard work and happy work for the school. She literally wore herself out in her never ceasing efforts in behalf of the work that she so dearly loved. During our married life, there were born to us 2 bright, beautiful boys, Booker Taliaferro and Ernest Davidson. The older of these, Booker, has already mastered the brickmaker's trade at Tuskegee. I have often been asked how I began the practice of public speaking. In answer, I would say that I never planned to give any large part of my life to speaking in public. I have always had more of an ambition to do things than to merely talk about doing them. It seems that when I went north with General Armstrong to speak at the series of public meetings to which I have referred, the president of the National Educational Association, the Honorable Thomas W. Bicknell, was present at one of these meetings and heard me speak. A few days later, he sent me an invitation to deliver an address at the next meeting of the Educational Association. This meeting was to be held in Madison, Wisconsin. I accepted the invitation. This was, in a sense, the beginning of my public speaking career. On the evening that I spoke before the association, there must have been not far from 4,000 persons present. Without my knowing it, there were a large number of people present from Alabama and some from the town of Tuskegee. These white people afterward frankly told me that they went to this meeting expecting to hear the South roundly abused, but were pleasantly surprised to find that there was no word of abuse in my address. On the contrary, the South was given credit for all the praiseworthy things it had done. A white lady who was a teacher in a college in Tuskegee wrote back to the local paper that she was gratified as well as surprised to note the credit which I gave to the white people of Tuskegee for their help in getting the school started. This address at Madison was the first that I had delivered that in any large measure dealt with the general problem of the races. Those who heard it seemed to be pleased that I said and with what I said and with the general position that I took. When I first came to Tuskegee, I determined that I would make it my home, that I would take as much pride in the right actions of the people of the town as any white man could do, and that I would at the same time deplore the wrongdoing of the people as much as any white man. I determined never to say anything in a public address in the North that I would not be willing to say in the South. I learned, I early learned that it is a hard matter to convert an individual by abusing him, and that it is more often accomplished by giving credit for all the praiseworthy actions performed than by calling attention alone to all the evil done. So he learned that you could get more flies with honey. While pursuing this policy, I have not failed at the proper time and in the proper manner to call attention in no uncertain terms to the wrongs which any part of the South has been guilty of. I have found that there is a large element of the South that is quick to respond to straightforward, honest criticism of any wrong policy. As a rule, the place to criticize the South when criticism is necessary is in the South, not in Boston. A Boston man who came to Alabama to criticize Boston would not affect so much good, I think, as one who had his word of criticism to say in Boston. So you criticize where the crime is happening. You don't leave home and talk stuff about it once you're out of town. In this address at Madison, I took the ground that the policy to be pursued with reference to the races was, by every honorable means, to bring them together and to encourage the cultivation of friendly relations, instead of doing that which would embitter. I further contended that in relation to his vote, the Negro should more and more consider the interests of the community in which he lived, rather than seek alone to please someone who lived 1,000 miles away from him and from his interests. In this address, I said that the whole future of the Negro rested largely upon the question as to whether or not he should make himself, through his skill, intelligence, and character, of such undeniable value to the community in which he lived that the community could not dispense with his presence. I said that any individual who learned to do something better than anybody else, learned to do a common thing in an uncommon manner, had solved his problem regardless of the color of his skin. And that in proportion as the Negro learned to produce what other people wanted and must have, in the same proportion, he would be respected. Come up with something people want to have, got a need, create a need, and find a way to fill it. I spoke of an instance where one of our graduates had produced 260 bushels of sweet potatoes from an acre of ground in a community where the average production had only been 49 bushels to that acre. He had been able to do this by reason of knowledge of chemistry of the soil and by his knowledge of improved methods of agriculture, so the technology. The white farmers in the neighborhood respected him and came to him for ideas regarding the raising of sweet potatoes. These white farmers honored and respected him because he, by his skill and knowledge, had added something to the wealth and the comfort of the community in which he lived. I explained that my theory of education for the Negro would not, for example, confine him for all time to farm life to the production of the best and most sweet potatoes, but that if he succeeded in this line of industry, he could lay the foundations upon which his children and grandchildren could grow to higher and more important things in life. But somebody still has to do the farming. Never forget that. Even as you elevate, somebody still has to do the farming. In brief, were some of the views I advocated in this first address dealing with the broad question of the relations of the two races. And since that time, I have not found any reason for changing my views on any important point. In my early life, I used to cherish a feeling of ill will toward anyone who spoke in bitter terms against the Negro or who advocated measures that tended to oppress the Black man or take from him opportunities for growth in the most complete manner. Now, whenever I hear anyone advocating measures that are meant to curtail the development of another, I pity the individual who would do this. I know that the one who makes this mistake does so because of his own lack of opportunity for the highest kind of growth. I pity him because I know that he is trying to stop the progress of the world, and because I know that in time, the development and the ceaseless advance of humanity will make him ashamed of his weak and narrow position. One might as well try to stop the progress of a mighty railroad train by throwing his body across the track as to try to stop the growth of a world in the direction of giving mankind more intelligence, more culture, more skill, more liberty, and in the direction of extending more sympathy and more brotherly kindness. The address which I delivered at Madison before the National Education Association gave me a rather wide introduction in the North, and soon after that, opportunities began offering themselves for me to address audiences there. I was anxious, however, that the way might also be open for me to speak directly to a representative Southern white audience. A partial opportunity of this kind, one that seemed to me might serve as an entering wedge, presented itself in 1893 when the International Meeting of Christian Workers was held at Atlanta, Georgia. When this invitation came to me, I had engagements in Boston that seemed to make it impossible for me to speak in Atlanta. Still, after looking over my list of dates and places carefully, I found that I could take a train from Boston that would get me to Atlanta about 30 minutes before my address was to be delivered, and that I could remain in that city about 60 minutes before taking another train for Boston. My invitation to speak in Atlanta stipulated that I was to confine my address to 5 minutes. The question then was whether or not I could put enough into a 5 minute address to make it worthwhile for me to take such a trip. I knew that the audience would be largely composed of the most influential class of white men and women, and that it would be a rare opportunity for me to let them know what we were trying to do at Tuskegee, as well as to speak to them about the relations of the races. So I decided to make the trip. I spoke for 5 minutes to an audience of 2,000 people, composed mostly of Southern and Northern whites. What I said seemed to be received with favor and enthusiasm. Excuse me. The Atlanta papers of the next day commented in friendly terms on my address, and a good deal was said about it in different parts of the country. I felt that I had in some degree accomplished my object, that of getting a hearing from the dominant class of the South. The demands made upon me for public addresses continued to increase, coming in about all numbers from my own people and from Northern whites. I gave as much time to these addresses as I could spare from the immediate work at Tuskegee. Most of the addresses in the North were made for the direct purpose of getting funds with which to support the school. Those delivered before the colored people had for their main object the impressing upon them of the importance of industrial and technical education in addition to academic and religious training. I now come I now come to that one of the incidents in my life which seems to have excited the greatest amount of interest and which perhaps went further than anything else in giving me a reputation that, in a sense, might be called national. I refer to the address which I delivered at the opening of the Atlanta Cotton States and International Exposition in Atlanta, Georgia on September 18th of 1895. Greetings, Sister Ra. How are you and the elders doing tonight? Thanks for tuning in. So much has been said and written about this incident, and so many questions have been asked me concerning this address that perhaps I may be excused for taking up the matter in some detail. The 5-minute address in Atlanta, which I came from Boston to deliver, was possibly the prime cause for an opportunity given me to make this second address here. In the spring of 1895, I received a telegram from prominent citizens in Atlanta asking me to accompany a committee from the city to Washington for the purpose of appearing before a committee of Congress in the extent of securing government help for the exposition. The committee was composed of about 25 of the most prominent and most influential white men of Georgia. All the members of this committee were white men except Bishop Grant, Bishop Gaines, and myself. The mayor and several other city and state officials spoke before the committee. They were followed by the two colored bishops. My name was last on the list of speakers. I had never before appeared before such a committee, nor had I ever delivered any address in the capital of the nation. I had many misgivings as to what I ought to say, and as to the impression that my address would make. While I cannot recall in detail what I said, I remember that I tried to impress upon the committee, with all the earnestness and plainness of any language that I could command, that if Congress wanted to do something which would assist in the ridding the South of the race question and making friends between the two races, it should, in every proper way, encourage the material and intellectual growth of both races. I said that the Atlanta Exposition would present the opportunity for both races to show what advance they have made since freedom and would at the same time afford encouragement to them to make still greater progress. I tried to emphasize the fact that while the Negro should not be deprived by unfair means of the franchise, political agitation alone would not save him, and that the back of the ballot he must have, and that back of the ballot he must have property, industry, skill, economy, intelligence, and character, and that no race without these elements could permanently succeed. I said that in granting the appropriation, Congress could do something that would prove to be of real and lasting value to both the races, and that it was the first great opportunity of the kind that had been presented since the close of the Civil War. I spoke for 15 or 20 minutes and was surprised at the close of my address to receive the hearty congratulations of the Georgia Committee and of the members of Congress who were present. The committee was unanimous in making a favorable report, and in a few days, the bill passed Congress. With the passing of this bill, the success of the Atlanta Exposition was assured. Soon after this trip to Washington, the directors of the exposition decided that it would be a fitting recognition of the colored race to erect a large and attractive building which should be devoted wholly to the showing of progress of the Negro since freedom. It was further decided to have the building designed and erected wholly by Negro mechanics. This plan was carried out. In design, beauty, and general finish, the Negro building was equal to the others on the grounds. After it was decided to have a separate Negro exhibit, the first question arose as to who should take charge of it. The officials of the exposition were anxious that I should assume this responsibility, but I declined to do so on the plea that the work at Tuskegee at that time demanded my time and strength. Largely at my suggestion, Mr. I. Garland Penn of Lynchburg, Virginia, was selected to be the head of the Negro department. I gave him all the aid I could. The Negro exhibit was, as a whole, was large and credible. The two exhibits in this department which attracted the greatest amount of attention were those from the Hampton Institute and the Tuskegee Institute. The people who seemed to be the most surprised, as well as pleased, that they saw at what they saw in the Negro building were the Southern white people. As the day for the opening of the exposition drew near, the board of directors began preparing the program for the opening exercises. In the discussion from day to day of the various features of this program, the question came up as to the advisability of putting a member of the Negro race on for one of the opening addresses, since the Negroes had been asked to take such a prominent part in the exposition. I was It was argued further that such recognition would mark the good feeling prevailing between the two races. Of course, there were those who were opposed to any such recognition of the rights of the Negro, but the board of directors, composed of men who represented the best and most progressive element of the South, had their way and voted to invite a black man to speak on opening day. The next thing was to decide upon the person who was thus to represent the Negro race. After the question had been canvassed for several days, the directors voted unanimously to ask me to deliver one of the opening day addresses, and in a few days after that, I received an official invitation. The receiving of this invitation brought me a sense of responsibility that would be hard for anyone not placed in my position to appreciate. What were my feelings when this invitation came to me? I remembered that I had been a slave, that my early years had been spent in the lowest depths of poverty and ignorance, that I had had little opportunity to prepare me for such a responsibility as this. It was only a few years before that time, that any white man in the audience might have claimed me as his slave, and it was easily possible that some of my former owners might be present to hear me speak. I knew too that this was the first time in the entire history of the Negro that a member of my race had been asked to speak from the same platform with white Southern men and women on any important national occasion. I was asked now to speak to an audience composed of the wealth and culture of the white South, the representatives of my former masters. I knew too that while the greater part of my audience would be composed of Southern people, Yet there would be present a large number of northern whites, as well as a great many men and women of my own race. I was determined to say nothing that I did not feel from the bottom of my heart to be true and right. When the invitation came to me, there was not one word of imitation as to what I should say, or as to what I should omit. In this, I felt that the board of directors had paid a tribute to me. They knew that by one sentence I could have blasted in large degree the success of the exposition. I was also painfully conscious of the fact that while I must be true to my own race and my utterances, I had it in my power to make such an ill timed address as would result in any preventing any similar invitation being extended to a Black man again for years to come. I was equally determined to be true to the North as well as to the best element of the white South in what I had to say. The papers, North and South, had taken up the discussion of my coming speech, and as the time for it drew near, this discussion became more and more widespread. Not a few of the Southern papers were unfriendly to the idea of my speaking. For my own race, I received many suggestions as to what I ought to say. I prepared myself as best I could for this address. But as the 18th of September drew nearer and nearer, the heavier my heart became, and the more I feared that my effort would prove a failure and disappointment. The invitation had come at a time when I was very busy with my schoolwork, as it was the beginning of the school year. After preparing my address, I went through it as I usually do with all utterances which I must consider particularly important with Miss Washington, and she approved of what I intended to say. Give me one moment. I'm having some technical difficulties. I'm having some technical difficulties. Give me one moment. All right. Thank you so much for waiting. After preparing my address, I went through it as I usually do with all those utterances which I consider particularly important with Miss Washington, and she approved of what I intended to say. On the 16th of September, the day before I was to start for Atlanta, many of the Tuskegee teachers expressed a desire to hear my address, that I consented to read it to them in that body. When I was done, So, when I had done so and had heard their criticisms and comments, I felt somewhat relieved since they seemed to think well of what I had to say. On the morning of the 17th of September, together with Mrs. Washington and my three children, I started for Atlanta. I felt a good deal as I suppose a man feels when he is on his way to the gallows. In passing through the town of Tuskegee, I met with a white farmer who lived some distance out in the country. In a jesting manner, this man said, "Washington, you have spoken before the northern white people, the Negroes in the South, and to us country white people in the South. But in Atlanta tomorrow, you will have before you the northern whites, the southern whites, and the Negroes all together. I am afraid that you have got yourself into a tight place. This farmer diagnosed the situation correctly, but his frank words did not add anything to my comfort. In the course of the journey from Tuskegee to Atlanta, both colored and white people came to the train to point me out and discussed with perfect freedom in my hearing what was going to take place the next day. We were met by a committee in Atlanta. Almost the first thing that I heard when I got off the train in that city was an expression something like this from an old colored man nearby. That's the man of my race was gonna make a speech at the exposition tomorrow. I sure gonna wanna hear it. Atlanta was literally packed at the time with people from all parts of this country, with representatives of foreign governments as well as with military and civic organizations. Afternoon papers had forecasts of the next day's proceedings in flaring headlines. All this tended to add to my burden. I did not sleep much that night. The next morning, before day, I went carefully over what I intended to say. I also kneeled down and asked God's blessing upon my effort. Right here, perhaps I ought to add that I make it a rule never to go before an audience upon any occasion without asking the blessing of God upon what I want to say. I always make it a rule to make special preparation for each separate address. No two audiences are alike. It is my aim to reach and talk to the heart of each individual audience, taking into my confidence very much as I would a person when I am speaking to an audience. I can I care little for how what I am saying is going to sound in the newspapers or to another audience or to an individual. At the time, the audience before me absorbs all my sympathy, thought, and energy. Early in the morning, a committee called to escort me to my place in the procession, which was to march to the exposition grounds. In this procession were very prominent colored citizens in carriages, as well as several Negro military organizations. I noted that the exposition officials seemed to go out of their way to see that all of the colored people in the procession were properly placed and properly treated. The procession was about 3 hours in reaching the exposition grounds, and during all of this time, the sun was shining down upon us disagreeably hot. When we reached the grounds, the heat, together with my nervous anxiety, made me feel as if I were about ready to collapse and to feel that my address was not going to be a success. When I entered the audience room, I found it packed with humanity from bottom to top, and there were thousands outside who could not get in. The room was very large and well suited to public speaking. When I entered the room, there were vigorous cheers from the colored portion of the audience and faint cheers from some of the white people. I had been told while I had been in Atlanta that many white people were going to be present to hear me speak, simply out of curiosity, and that others who would be present would be in full sympathy with me. There was still a larger element of the audience, which would consist of those who were going to be present for the purpose of hearing me make a fool of myself, or at least of hearing me say something foolish, so that they could say to the officials who had invited me to speak, "See, I told you so." One of the trustees of the Tuskegee Institute, as well as my personal friend, Mr. William H. Baldwin Jr., was at the time the general manager of the Southern Railroad and happened to be in Atlanta that day. He was so nervous about the kind of reception I would have and the effect that my speech would produce, that he could not persuade himself to go into the building, but walked back and forth in the grounds outside until the opening exercises were over. And that is the end of chapter 13. So, as you can see, he was nervous about that speech that he was about to give because he had a mixed audience. He had an audience of people that he could not imagine how to cater to the full constituency he had before him. But he did it nonetheless. Nevertheless, he did it. All right. There is a live stream happening on Black Magus' channel. It started at 8 o'clock. We should all go over there. I appreciate each and every one of you for listening. I want to say thank you to Black Magus. Thank you to KW97, to The Forecast, to Anthony McPhail, to Sister Raw, and to Oni from the Pro Black Perspective, to Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, to Brother Bakari from the Brother Bakari Show, and to from Afro Native, thank you to Afro Native. And I appreciate each and every one of you. I will see you tomorrow at 8 p.m. at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where we'll be reading chapters 14 and 15 tomorrow. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you to Sister Ron, the elders listening with her. Peace, guys.